Danielle Whitmore stood in the hallway of the house her husband built for her, with his own hands, one hand pressed against her mouth, listening to a voice she had known her entire life say something she was never supposed to hear. In a few hours, she was supposed to be lying on an operating table, trusting the people closest to her to be waiting for her when she woke up. Instead, she stood frozen against the wall, gripping a small pill bottle, learning that the two people she trusted most in the world had already decided how they would spend the hours she would be unconscious and unable to stop them. She did not scream. She did not walk into that kitchen and demand answers. What she chose to do next would change the entire direction of her life, and it started with something as small as a bottle of medication she had nearly left behind. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Danielle was 36 years old, and for the past 4 years she had been a widow, a word she still had trouble saying out loud without her voice catching. Her husband, Marcus, had died suddenly of a heart condition nobody had known about, leaving her alone in a house full of memories and a piece of land just outside their town in western Pennsylvania that had been in his family for 2 generations. Before he passed, Marcus made sure everything was in order, the deed transferred cleanly into Danielle's name, a final act of love meant to give her security for the rest of her life. She had never remarried, never seriously considered it, choosing instead to rebuild her life quietly around her work as a 3rd-grade elementary school teacher and the property her husband had left behind, the one place that still felt like him. Danielle had met Marcus at 26, at a time in her life when she had all but stopped believing that steady, uncomplicated love was something people actually got to have. He worked in construction, the same trade his father and grandfather had worked before him, and the first time she saw him, he was standing on a half-finished roof frame 2 streets from her apartment, laughing at something one of his crew had said, completely unaware anyone was watching. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony on the same piece of land that would one day become the center of everything, surrounded by fewer than 40 guests, Marcus insisting the whole time that the only thing that mattered was that she showed up. For 9 years, their marriage was the kind of steady, unremarkable happiness that people rarely think to be grateful for, until it is gone, quiet mornings, shared chores, a running joke about who left the porch light on overnight. The morning Marcus died had started like any other. He had gone out to check on a fence line at the edge of their property, come back inside complaining of tightness in his chest that he brushed off as nothing, and collapsed in the kitchen less than 20 minutes later, while Danielle was still at school, halfway through an afternoon lesson. By the time she arrived at the hospital, there was nothing left to do but sign the paperwork that made his death official. He was 39 years old. In the weeks that followed, Danielle discovered that Marcus had spent the final years of his life quietly making sure she would never have to worry about the roof over her head, updating the deed, paying off what remained of the mortgage, meeting privately with an attorney to make certain that no matter what happened to him, the land would be hers outright, entirely, without conditions. Despite everything Marcus had left her, Danielle never saw herself as someone who had more than her family. Every month, without being asked, she transferred a portion of her income to her mother and sister, an arrangement that started as a small gesture of support after Marcus's death and slowly became something they simply expected. Patricia used it to cover rising costs on a fixed income, and Renee, still finding her footing, leaned on it more than she ever admitted out loud. Danielle never complained about the arrangement, never brought it up at family gatherings, never once suggested it was owed to her in return. She simply believed that taking care of her family was part of who she was, the same quiet responsibility she had carried her entire life, never imagining that same generosity was being counted on as leverage against her. Danielle's mother, Patricia, and her younger sister, Renee, had never fully accepted that the land belonged to Danielle alone. In the years since Marcus's death, there had been comments at holidays, Offhand remarks about how the property was too much for one woman to manage by herself, suggestions that it should stay in the family in a more meaningful way, meaning divided, meaning shared, meaning eventually passed to Renee, who still lived at home and had never quite found her footing the way Danielle had. Danielle brushed off these comments for years, choosing to believe her family simply cared about her, unaware that behind the concern was something far more calculated than she ever imagined, a plan that had been quietly taking shape for longer than she would ever have guessed. What Danielle did not know at the time, and would not learn until much later, was that Renee's financial situation had grown far worse than anyone in the family realized. Renee had taken out a series of short-term loans over the previous year, first to cover a car repair, then to cover the loan she had taken to cover the first, the kind of quiet financial spiral that becomes nearly impossible to escape once it starts. She had stopped opening certain envelopes months earlier, letting them stack unopened on her dresser, telling herself she would deal with them once things settled down, a day that never seemed to come. Patricia knew more than she let on, having covered 2 of Renee's missed payments herself, using money from the monthly allowance Danielle had been sending, money that was meant to help her mother, not to quietly fund her sister's mounting debt. It was this pressure, more than any long-held resentment about the land itself, that had finally pushed Patricia to agree to a plan she would never have considered in calmer circumstances. That particular morning had been circled on her calendar for nearly 2 months. Danielle was scheduled for a moderately serious surgical procedure, one that would require full anesthesia and a hospital stay of at least 1 night, the kind of procedure that leaves a person groggy and disoriented for hours after they wake. Her mother had insisted on being there, offering to sit with her through recovery, an offer Danielle accepted gratefully, believing for the first time in years that her family was showing up simply because they loved her. She woke early that morning, nervous but hopeful, dressed quietly, and packed her bag, unaware that the offer to be by her side had very little to do with comfort and everything to do with opportunity. She had already backed out of the driveway when she realized the medication her surgeon required her to bring, the one the clinic had called twice to confirm, was still sitting on the kitchen counter exactly where she left it the night before. It was an easy mistake to make on a morning full of nerves, but it meant turning the car around and walking back into a house she had left only minutes earlier. She told herself it would take 2 minutes, grab the bottle, lock the door, get back on the road. She had no way of knowing that those 2 minutes would end up being the most important 2 minutes of her entire life, the 2 minutes that would ultimately save everything her husband had left her. The house was quieter than she expected when she stepped back inside, the kind of quiet that felt wrong before she could even explain why. There was no television playing, no radio in the kitchen, only the low, deliberate sound of her mother's voice coming from the next room. Danielle paused at the edge of the hallway, one hand still resting on the doorframe, and something in her chest told her to stay exactly where she was instead of announcing she was back. She stood there, pill bottle gripped tightly in her hand, and listened to her mother speaking in a tone she had never heard before, careful, hushed, and deliberate in a way that made her stomach tighten before she even understood the words. "She won't even know until it's already signed," her mother said, and Danielle felt her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery waiting for her that morning. She stayed pressed against the wall, barely breathing, as her mother continued speaking to someone on the other end of the line, someone who seemed to already understand exactly what was being planned. Danielle heard her sister Renee's name mentioned more than once, followed by the words hospital, paperwork, and consent form, spoken in a sequence that made her chest tighten with a dread she could not yet fully name. Whatever this conversation was about, it involved her directly, and it was clear she had never been meant to hear a single word of it. Piece by piece, Danielle began to understand what she was listening to. Her mother was on the phone with a notary Renee had apparently already arranged to meet at the hospital later that day, someone willing to notarize documents at bedside for an extra fee, no questions asked. The plan, as Danielle understood it while standing frozen in her own hallway, was simple and devastating. While she was still under the effects of anesthesia, Disoriented and unable to fully understand what was placed in front of her, her mother and sister intended to have her sign a property transfer disguised among the routine hospital discharge paperwork, using her own confusion and trust against her. The land Marcus had left her, the last piece of him she had left, would be signed away in a haze she would barely remember, and by the time she was clear-headed enough to notice, it would already be done. Danielle stood completely still, the pill bottle now damp from how tightly she gripped it in her palm. Every part of her wanted to walk into that kitchen and demand an explanation, to ask her mother directly how long this had been planned, and how she could do this to her own daughter using the memory of a dead man's love against her. But something stronger than anger held her in place, a quiet and steady instinct telling her that confronting them in that moment would only give them time to change course, to hide the paperwork, to wait for another opportunity when she was even less prepared to protect herself. She made a decision standing in that hallway, one she would carry with her into the operating room just hours later, that she would not let them know what she had heard until she was ready. She left the house without saying a word, closing the door softly behind her so it would not draw attention, and sat in her car for nearly 10 minutes before she trusted herself to drive safely. Her hands shook, not from fear of the surgery ahead of her, but from the realization that the two people meant to care for her during her most vulnerable hours had been planning to use those very hours against her. She thought about Marcus, about the care he had taken to make sure she would always have this piece of land, about every promise he made her before he passed, and she made a silent vow in that car that whatever happened inside that hospital, she would not let anyone take away the last thing he had given her. By the time she arrived at the hospital, Danielle had already made a decision that would define everything that happened over the following 24 hours. Rather than confronting her mother in the parking lot, she chose a quieter and far more deliberate path. During intake, while her mother waited outside the room believing everything was proceeding as planned, Danielle quietly informed her surgical team that she did not want any documents signed on her behalf during recovery, and that any paperwork related to property or legal matters should be withheld from her entirely until she was fully alert and able to review it herself, in writing, with her own attorney present. The nursing staff, trained to take patient instructions seriously, noted the request clearly in her chart, without asking why, and Danielle went into surgery that morning carrying a secret her family had no idea she was holding. The procedure itself went smoothly, and Danielle woke hours later in a recovery room, exactly as groggy and disoriented as her mother had likely anticipated she would be. What Patricia and Renee had not anticipated was the instruction already recorded in her chart, one the recovery nurse followed without hesitation when Renee arrived that afternoon, with a folder of papers and a notary trailing quietly behind her, ready to move quickly while Danielle was still coming out of the anesthesia. The nurse politely informed them that per the patient's own written instructions, no documents could be presented or signed during this stage of recovery, and that any such matters would need to wait until the patient was formally discharged and cleared by her physician. Renee's expression in that moment, according to hospital staff who later spoke with Danielle, shifted from confusion to something far closer to panic. Danielle remained in the hospital for one additional night, officially for observation, though in truth she used the extra time to quietly call her own attorney, a woman she had worked with years earlier when settling Marcus's estate, someone with no connection whatsoever to the family. She explained everything she had overheard that morning, every detail she could remember, and asked her attorney to immediately place a formal hold on the property title, along with a request for a full record of any notary appointments scheduled at the hospital that week. By the time Danielle was discharged 2 days later, appearing to her family as nothing more than a patient recovering normally from a routine procedure, she had already built a paper trail documenting exactly what her mother and sister had attempted to do. What her attorney uncovered in the days that followed added a layer to the situation Danielle had not anticipated. The notary Renee had arranged was not simply a family acquaintance doing a favor. Records obtained through the State Notary Licensing Board showed he had been the subject of 2 prior complaints, both involving elderly or recently hospitalized clients who later claimed they had signed documents they did not fully understand at the time. Neither complaint had resulted in formal charges, but both had been noted in his file, a pattern that suggested this was not the first time he had agreed to notarize paperwork under circumstances designed to minimize a signer's ability to understand what they were agreeing to. Danielle's attorney recommended forwarding this information to the state board, along with a formal statement, not to punish her family further, but to ensure the same arrangement could not easily be repeated with someone less prepared than Danielle had been. The discovery unsettled Danielle in a way the original plan had not. It meant her mother and sister had not stumbled into this idea on their own, desperate and improvising in the moment, but had instead sought out someone who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet exploitation, someone experienced enough to make the entire process look routine to hospital staff who did not know better. It was one thing to imagine her family acting out of financial desperation in a single reckless moment. It was another to realize how deliberately the plan had been assembled, piece by piece, over weeks she had known nothing about. 3 weeks later, Danielle invited her mother and sister to the house for what she described as a simple family dinner, a chance to reconnect now that she was feeling stronger. They arrived expecting an ordinary evening, unaware that Danielle had already met with her attorney twice, unaware that the property title now carried a formal protective hold, and unaware that Danielle had, without ever raising her voice, obtained a signed statement from the recovery room nurse, confirming exactly what had happened that day. When Danielle calmly placed the documents on the table in front of them after dinner, there was no yelling, no dramatic accusation, only a steady and measured explanation of exactly what she knew and exactly what she intended to do moving forward. The silence that followed said more than any argument ever could have. In the months that followed, Danielle made the difficult decision to formally limit her mother and sister's access to her life, not out of cruelty, but out of a need to protect what remained of the world Marcus had built for her. The monthly allowance that had quietly supported her mother and sister for years came to an end without dramatic announcement, simply absent from their accounts the following month, a silence that spoke louder than any conversation could have. The property stayed exactly where it belonged, fully and legally in her name, untouched by the plan that had nearly stripped it away from her during the most vulnerable hours of her recovery. Patricia reached out twice in the months that followed, first with a lengthy letter attempting to explain the pressure she had been under, and later with a shorter, quieter message, simply asking whether there was any way forward. Danielle did not respond to either right away. When she finally did, months later, it was not with anger but with a boundary stated plainly, that she was open to rebuilding a relationship built on honesty, but that the financial arrangement of the past was permanently over, and that trust, once broken this deliberately, would need to be earned back slowly, on her terms, at her own pace. Renee's path proved harder, without the allowance she had quietly depended on, and facing the debts she had spent over a year avoiding, she was eventually forced to confront her financial situation directly, working with a credit counselor to slowly rebuild what she had let fall apart. Danielle heard about this secondhand, through Patricia, and felt something closer to sadness than satisfaction, understanding that the sister she had once trusted completely had been drowning long before that morning in the hallway and had simply chosen the wrong way to ask for help. A year later, Danielle stood on that same porch on a quiet evening in early autumn, the land stretching out in front of her, exactly as it had the day Marcus first showed it to her. She had planted a small garden near the fence line that spring, the kind of ordinary, hopeful project she would never have started while consumed by legal disputes and family fallout. She still thought of that morning often, not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of gratitude, recognizing that a single forgotten bottle of medication had given her the one thing her family's plan depended on her never having, enough time to understand exactly what was happening before it was too late to stop it. Danielle often thought back to that ordinary morning, to the small and almost forgettable decision to turn her car around, and how that single choice had quietly saved the last piece of the life she and her husband had built together, protecting it long after he was gone. If this story affected you the way it affected us putting it together, let us know down in the comments what you would have done in Danielle's position. Stories like this remind us that staying calm and protecting what matters can be far more powerful than reacting in the moment. If you want to see more real and eye-opening stories like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next video. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We will see you in the next one.